This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Distler, here to kick things off. This week, Vlad Kogan, professor at The Ohio State University, joins us to discuss his new book, No Adult Left Behind, which argues that local democratic control, not funding or curriculum, is the real reason students are falling behind. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam highlights a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research on the long-term benefits of participating in high school sports. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming today's special guest, Vlad Kogan. Vlad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Vlad is a professor and director of undergraduate studies at The Ohio State University. Also joining us, as always, my colleague, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Always a pleasure.
Yes, I forgot. I'm supposed to call you the David Griffith.
If you must.
Well, you know, it makes sense because there's another David Griffith in education.
That is actually true.
Yes, that you get confused with sometimes. A very nice guy who works over at ASCD. And yeah, every once in a while I see on social media, people think he's you or you're him. And it's a mess.
I have a feeling that my presence annoys him, but I can't do anything about my presence. So we have to carry on.
Oh, my goodness. Well, Vlad, we are so glad to have you with us. Vlad is coming out with the book on August 21st called No Adult Left Behind. This is your magnus opus, applying your field of political science to education. As somebody who majored in political science many years ago, you are speaking my language. Let's talk all about it on Ed Reform Update. Okay, so Vlad, the subtitle, how politics hijacks education and hurts kids. So you are saying politics, I guess, is the problem. Is that your thesis? What's the thesis? What's your argument here?
Yeah, I think it's a bit more broader than that. I would say governance is the problem, right? We have this great system of having elections and making policy through elections. And I think that works well in many ways. I think in education, it doesn't work so well because there's this fundamental disconnect that schools exist to educate kids, but kids don't vote. And adults do. And it turns out, if you look, actually who's voting in the relevant elections, it's mostly adults without kids. And I think that introduces many of the problems that we ultimately see manifest themselves in the data, in the achievement gaps, and all the other problems that public schools face.
All right, so let's get into this on some specifics. So first of all, is what you're really talking about local school boards? Is that which is fine with us because we hate local school boards to many degrees, right? I mean, Checker's written a million times about how we would be great if we could get rid of school boards. I remember, I think was it Matthew Miller who wrote this seminal piece in the Atlantic that said, let's get rid of all the school boards. Now, the problem is we're never going to get rid of the school boards. I think 100 years from now, we're still going to have all the school boards. But is that what this is about?
Sort of. So I think it's particularly bad with local school boards because of some unique institutional design features, especially, on off-cycle elections, which is the dominant form of when elections are held. If you look to see who votes in general, in most elections, most voters don't have school-age kids, but that's especially true in these low turnout off-cycle elections because the electorate really skews older. And so you get even fewer parents and you get even fewer people who are kind of much more removed from the day-to-day implications, I think, of kind of what's at stake on those elections. But I would say it's not just limited to those. I think it's a more general phenomenon with elections and democracy more broadly.
Okay, so even at, say, the state policy level where you're voting for a governor, the fact that the governor and the state legislature make a lot of decisions that have to do with schools, but a lot of the people voting aren't actually connected to those schools. That's the basic problem?
That's one of the problems, yeah. So I think, let me just kind of lay out, I think, the series of problems. So,
okay.
It fundamentally starts with really this problem of voters not having much skin in the game, right? When you don't have school-age kids, it's not to say that only parents care about education, But just the nature of concerns is different, right? It hits you a little bit more personally when it actually affects your kids. It affects you in ways that I think, again, when you're once removed, it becomes a little bit more symbolic. It's about, culture wars of the day and how you think about that. But that's not, I think, the only issue. I think it manifests downstream in the kinds of considerations that voters bring to these elections. And I know that you guys talked about this a few weeks ago, but we have a new paper, and many people have published as well, that in these elections, voters just don't care about learning, right? Whether students are learning more or less does not affect what happens to the incumbents. And as a result, it doesn't really create very strong incentives for office holders to do a good job. And I think that's true really across the board. I mean, it's definitely true at state legislative elections. We know state legislators are really not punished or rewarded for performance in any sense. I think it may be a little bit true with governors, but I think much more so for the economy than for the educational outcomes we care about. So I do think it is a fundamental problem that's hardwired into democracy. In the same way that I think, we have an independent central bank because we think elected officials, when they make monetary policy, have some perverse incentives, and we have this alternative system to try to counteract some of those incentives. I think in education, we don't have any counteracting designs that address, I think, the lack of good incentives that democracy creates.
Well, and it's fascinating because, of course, the progressive reformers from over 100 years ago, that's what they thought they were creating, right? They thought that the school boards were going to take politics out of education, right? You were going to take this away from general purpose government, from the mayors, from the city, the town, the city councilors, what do they call them in Chicago? The aldermen?
Yeah.
Right. And you would have instead this blue ribbon board that would, as you say, care about learning and things that really matter. And therefore, and yet you're saying, actually, we have a perversion of that, right? That of any institution, probably the school boards are most susceptible to small p politics because it's so easy for interest groups to take them over. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think interest groups are a part of the story for sure. But, when we think about identity politics, when we think about partisanship and those influences, I don't think it's just an interest group story. I think that's also a mass electorate story. And some of those influences, I think, are just as disruptive and negative. Okay. But to your question about the progressives, I think they were sort of both right and wrong. So when we think about what are the reforms that they pushed, it was really a basket, right? One of those was about election timing. And the idea is we have local elections not in November of even years. Maybe some of these national partisan forces will be less salient. That maybe happened, but again, it had the opposite, some countervailing effects, which is, it also shifted political power to older voters without school-age kids, right? And I think that created its own set of problems. I think one thing they got right, which again, I would definitely double it down on, is taking party labels off the ballot. I think was actually a good idea. And now we're seeing, many states bring those back. And I don't necessarily think that will lead to better outcomes because, again, party labels don't necessarily tell us much about how good of a job these folks are doing in improving education. They tell you a lot about, do these folks agree with the partisanship of the adults in the district, which is not necessarily related to learning. But I think the other area where the progressives really got it wrong, and part of it was about elections. There was creation of superintendents, and the idea is we have trained professionals, but they're going to do a good job. And I think, I don't know necessarily that more professionals and trained professionals has been a success story. And, one of the case studies in the book is really the politics around the science of reading. And that's arguably a story about trained professionals really getting it wrong, right? So I think the way we train educators, the way we train superintendents, might mean that the progressive vision of trained professionals doesn't actually manifest itself in better outcomes in the way that, again, maybe, somebody like a central banker that has a different kind of education maybe are more effective in providing some sanity to monetary policy in a way that I think people with an education background don't necessarily do.
Interesting. So we need a Jerome Powell for education. Interesting. All right, David.
Yeah. Maybe we have him in Houston. Maybe that's what's going on there. But yeah.
Oh, no, that's interesting, right? That there's an example of at least the state coming in, giving power to a state-appointed superintendent and Mike Miles, no local school board, that's at least not an elected one, and a lot of power. David, what questions do you have for Vlad?
Yeah, well, it's the obvious question is, what's your solution, right? You've identified a lot of problems that I'm familiar with, and it's very hard to. I mean, I like the idea of a Jerome Powell for education, I tend to be, I think one of the bigger differences between one of the ways in which I'm still center left as opposed to right is I tend to be more comfortable with the idea of sort of appointed power, right? Or, separating some institutions from the political process and putting some faith in people who have devoted their lives to the subject matter and want to do the right thing. That's not quite how I would describe school boards, but it's how I would describe some bureaucracies. It's how I would describe the Fed. Are you suggesting that? And if not, what are you suggesting?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily suggesting that. I think, Mike Miles is maybe an exception. I think our track record with state takeovers in general, on average, probably not too great. But I guess let me answer, I think, in two ways. One is I don't necessarily have a solution, but I think it's really, really important that we take the problem seriously. And, one thing that really motivated, me writing this book, and maybe it comes out a little bit too much, is like my frustration with some of the rhetoric and debate. And I'll give you two examples. I think what's going on in Houston right now is really positive, right? We have a district that has made tremendous gains, and yet there is a lot of criticism, and not in denying the gains, but saying, but what about democracy? What about democracy? Yeah. And I think another example is what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, where the state came in. They didn't take over the district. They just brought in really high-performing charter schools. We have, according to Doug Harris, really incredible gains. I think there are some crazy conspiracy theorists that dispute those gains, but I think everybody, for the most part, agrees that they were, for the most part, real. But again, people say, well, forget the gains, what about democracy? And so I think one of my frustrations is, in education, I think we often use democracy as a cudgel to kind of, as a drop the mic type argument. But I argue that I don't think we should, right? In the same way that, when judges step in and block the president's executive actions, and people say, but what about democracy? We say, well, democracy is not just about elections. Democracy has these other considerations as well. So that's part of my argument, that we should not use just elections and democracy as an argument to dismiss, I think, reforms that really produce gains for children, that I think too often, particularly amongst people that study education, tend to do. But so to your really the meat of your question, are there things we can do on the margin? I think there is. I'm not necessarily arguing for getting rid of elections. I'm not necessarily arguing for bringing in Jerome Powell for education. But I do think we have some evidence that really suggests there's three things we could do better that I think would modestly but importantly move the needle in the right direction. So one is, I mentioned election timing. Having elections in November of even years, I think we have really good evidence that it increases the number of voters who are parents, number of voters that have skin in the game, which I think is important. And we have some evidence from California that it also increases accountability, that when elections for school boards are held in November of even years, incumbents are punished and rewarded for learning or lack thereof. And I think that creates some positive incentives. So I think it's one type of reform that I would be in favor of. I think the second thing we can do is make performance, and by performance, I mean the right kind of performance, really growth, more salient. And we get a lot of evidence that parents respond to report cards from the state, a lot of evidence that voters respond to report cards from the state. So I would love to, again, really be much more intentional and strategic in really making academic considerations more salient to voters when they're voting. And so, for example, just crazy example, but again, I'm not a fan of party labels. I would love to print accountability ratings on the ballot. All right, party labels don't tell us anything about kids. Accountability ratings do. And so, I think having that right on the ballot would be a great way, in a very subtle way, to kind of nudge voters to really think about that a little bit more. And then third, I think one area where we have some evidence is on school choice, and in particular, the competitive effects of choice, right? Not necessarily, the impact for the kids who actually leave the public schools, but we know from places like Florida and David Figlio's work that once there is an option to leave, it really changes fundamentally the internal dynamics in school districts, and it makes them take the interests of those students more seriously. That I think helps maybe mute some of the adult political issues that in the absence of that competition really drive, I think, a lot of the problems and dysfunctions that we see.
Yeah.
So those would be my combination of reforms: is on-site elections, information, and choice.
That's great. And that last piece, is this old who wrote the book about voice and exit, right?
Hirschman, yeah.
Hirschman. That, and so it is hard in a democracy with so many, especially in, say, a large district. My kids go to Montgomery County, Maryland, 160,000 kids, million people in the county. These school board elections are like, major political elections. It's hard to have an impact, anybody, if you're concerned about something. Maybe it works out differently if you're in a tiny district and you actually know the school board members. But if there's options to leave, if enough people can vote with their feet, that is something that clearly does get the attention of people. And it does seem like, at least in charter schools, a different governance model is part of why those schools outperform traditional public schools. But we have to acknowledge. Right. Yeah, but it's not like a huge difference, right? I mean, charter schools are, let's say urban charter schools, okay, much better, right? Other charter schools, it's a mix, right? But getting the politics right helps, right? It's necessary, but not sufficient. I mean, we still need our friends like Robert Pendicios of the world who, are deeply embedded in the actual stuff of schooling, right? Because the politics can mess things up. But even if you get the politics right, which I think the charter school sector largely does, you still then have to follow through and get the other pieces right.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. And, it's interesting, your point about charter schools. We know they're kind of heterogeneous on average, probably about as good as the public schools, but in urban areas, much better. And I think it's actually totally consistent with my argument, because I would argue that, for many of the reasons that we've been talking about, it's especially in urban areas where the political processes are the most dysfunctional, and the electoral incentives are just misaligned, right? That what it takes to win elections, what it is that your constituents care about, is either completely unrelated to student learning, or in some cases might actually be like at the expense of student learning. And imagine putting an elected official in that position where you have to choose: do I do what's best for kids, or do I do what gets me reelected? And I think in many communities that's the position that we're in, and we shouldn't be surprised that that they don't always put the interests and academic concerns first.
Well said. We will leave it there. Again, Vladimir Kogan, No Adult Left Behind, coming to a bookstore online or in person near you soon, August 21st. Did I hear that this was Cambridge University Press?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's fantastic. Thanks for coming on the show, Vlad.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite Adams Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back with you.
Yeah, listen, I'm going to keep my chatting to a minimum right now because I have a lot to say about the topic that you're covering. So I'll save my time for after the Research Minute. So what do you have on the Research Minute this week?
We can talk about all our favorite sports teams at the end instead of at the beginning of the Research Minute this time.
Exactly.
All right. Well, this week we have a study that asks about sports. It asks about high school athletes. It examines whether athletic participation in high school and in college, also talks about college, pays dividends in education and even earnings later in life. So they look at high school and college. I'm going to focus on the high school stuff since we're a K-12 education policy think tank. The researchers use two big federal longitudinal data sets, the NELS 88 and the ELS 2002, which track students from high school into adulthood. The researchers match athletes and non-athletes on a huge set of background variables that include family income, parent education, and importantly, cognitive and non-cognitive measures to estimate what they say are causal effects of playing school sports on long-term outcomes. I have a little more to say on whether we believe the causal effects in a minute. Across both data sets, varsity athletes in high school see clear benefits. In NELS, male varsity athletes were about 7 percentage points more likely to graduate high school and 12 points more likely to attend a 4-year college compared to their non-athlete peers. Female athletes show nearly the same gains in college going, and their college graduation bump is even larger, about 15 percentage points. In both data sets, male and female athletes also earn more money later on in the labor market, with wage premiums in the 9 to 18% range, depending on gender and data set. Now, what about students who don't finish high school or don't go to college? The authors do a separate analysis on dropout athletes, high school varsity athletes who leave school before graduating or who graduate but don't go to college. Here, the results are a little more mixed. In most cases, athletes are either no worse off than their non-athlete peers, or even modestly better off in terms of earnings, but it is kind of mixed and a lot of statistically insignificant results. The one negative finding is for female high school varsity athletes who drop out of high school in the NELS data set. That one is statistically significant. And they actually they earn less than their non-athlete peers. But otherwise, the story is that it generally is not hurting the athletic participation, even when students don't follow the standard academic pipeline. Now, when the authors run propensity score matching that's their main method of kind of getting a control group, they include interaction terms for background variables like family income and single parent household status. That lets them see if the effects of sports participation is different for those groups. What they find is that the positive effects of varsity sports on graduation, college attendance, and earnings are at least as strong and sometimes even stronger for students from lower income and single parent households. Now, I want to say just a thing quickly about causality here. The authors say that these effects are not just correlations. They use propensity score matching, as I mentioned, with a very rich set of controls, including cognitive ability, important non-cognitive factors, and family background to approximate the counterfactuals and estimate the effects. That makes the findings a lot stronger than just an anecdote about, how sports builds character or something. But I have to say that I immediately thought of two confounding factors that I didn't see them controlling for in their paper, and that, I don't know, we can debate whether these are as important as I think they might be. But one of those is health, which you would assume makes students more likely to be athletes. And relatedly, and I don't know how else to put this, but physical attractiveness is another, and that may mostly come from health. But you would assume that students who go on to be athletes are in better physical shape. And we know that health and especially physical attractiveness is a huge advantage in life, including in the workforce. Now, this paper is co-authored by Nobel laureate economist James Heckman, who is basically the world expert on selection bias in research. So I was a little surprised that they did not talk about those factors in the paper, although they would have been impossible to control for because I don't think they're in the data sets in any form. Anyway, I'll end with this. The big takeaway for K-12 policy, especially if you believe the causal story, is that athletic participation, and this extends to college sports and intramural college sports, which I didn't cover, they help students build important non-cognitive skills. And we know that those skills are important for succeeding at school and in life.
Well, first of all, great job, Adam. Thank you for covering that so well, including these questions about selection, because I think these are big questions. I mean, it was fascinating. I would not have thought about health and attractiveness, but I think those are fair questions. And just in general, it's so hard to nail down selection. I understand they have these rich variables, but still, I think just common sense, our own real world experience says we know there's just some kids that participate in stuff like sports growing up who have families who encourage them to participate, and some kids and families that don't. And I suspect, a huge overlap with participating in sports and participating in church and participating in Boy Scouts. And, there's just sort of joiners and non-joiners, right? Especially as our society has this issue with more and more isolation, atomization. So I don't know. I guess I just always wonder if you can control for that. But look, I at the same time, of course, I buy it. We've talked about this before. Like, of course, it's good for kids to participate in sports. I imagine if you could do a study like this on participating in the music program at your school or the theater program, you would find similar things as well. I've got more to say, but what do you think, David? First of all, do you buy it? It's causal. Do you think they address that?
No, I'm with you guys. I can think of other, without knowing the entire list of non-cognitive things, right? I just with you, joiners is a good way of putting it, right? I think academics is also more like sports than people think, right? You simply can't become, I would say participators, right? Like, or continuers, right? Gritty people, right, can become good long distance runners, right? They can master calculus. I guess the opposite of that is something like quitters, right? Which sounds mean, but if you are inclined to wash out of things, you're going to struggle in school, and
So
you're also not going to make the team.
I gotta say,
Um,
guys, though, like they
yeah,
do a attempt to control for the factors you're talking about. Family factors, they have a bunch of that stuff,
yeah.
and non-cognitive factors and this gritty stuff. Your self-concept, they have
Mhm.
several different non-cognitive factors. So they are making a pretty strong attempt, and I think I mostly buy those attempts. They really are trying to control for the stuff
Yeah.
you all are mentioning.
All right, I'll take it. Listen, I'll take your word for it. You know, fair point. I
But
mean, I think
but
in some ways it's more interesting to talk about the mechanisms, right? Because I think just saying sports are good it doesn't get us very far, right? I mean, why are they good? Are they good because, there's social mixing, right? And you can actually make friends with the kid in IB class, or the kid whose dad runs the local business, right? Are they good because they keep you out of trouble between 3 and 6 p.m.? Are they good because they, are sort of implicitly teaching these life skills that we're kind of alluding to here? I don't know. Mike, what do you think?
yeah, no, and when we say sports, like, is it high school varsity sports or is it,
Yes.
I mean,
Like,
there's some high schools where the only way you got a shot at making most varsity teams is if you've been playing competitive sports since you were little.
Hmm.
That's not always everywhere, but in a lot of places. So is it, should you control for prior participation in sports, or would that not make sense, right? But I think this notion of joiners is important. But then there's also the policy question, right? So what? I mean, there's, I think, an implication for parents, which is, for example, those of us that have decided to let their sons play varsity football, despite the risks with concussions and the like. You can say, well, there's a trade-off here, is that there's all these benefits from varsity football. Then you got to weigh that against the risks. Okay, that's one thing. Another one would be, should we be requiring kids to participate in something like sports? If you go to a private school, a lot of private high schools do that, right? They say you must. Checker tells us funny stories from his time at Exeter back in the day when he was on the golf team because he had to be on some team, and so that's what he picked. And it did not lead to a lifelong love of golf. But there was, a lot of private schools have that theory, right? They're like, look, this isn't to us extracurricular. This is part of the curriculum. We want to build leaders. We want to help you learn about teamwork and perseverance. And instead of trying to teach that in math, we're going to teach that on the playing field or in the orchestra. And, so there's an argument. Should public schools say, look, we're not going to leave this to chance. We are going to make you choose a sport or a musical program or an artistic program, and you must participate. Now, if you did that, I imagine then some of these outcomes maybe disappear, right? Although if they're controlling for selection, maybe they don't. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it would help with the research design, right? If we did this in a few places, we would have to worry about all the selection bias. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think this is hard because the schools that you are talking about that tend to require sports, I think, are generally schools of choice. So your family's sending you there because they want you to be a part of a bunch of stuff that's not just academic, maybe. And that is harder with compulsory education. And you're gonna, force everybody in the community to do this. And then if they don't show up for their soccer practice, are you kicking them out of school, or what's the consequence? It raises a lot of questions. So I like the idea in principle. I'm just not sure how it would apply in different kind of
Yeah.
contexts.
Yeah.
When I was in grade school, I spent 1 year at an English boarding school, and I was required to play rugby, and they would not tell me the rules. So I'm against this.
Well, they were clearly just hazing the
They,
Americans.
they, they refused to tell me the rules, and it was not fun. I sort of picked up some of them.
I am, I'm writing
Tackle
something
the
right now
American was
about
the main rule on that.
we've talked about summer jobs on here before. I'm writing something about it right now. It's so clearly good for kids to have a summer job. And we have this disparity where it's actually easier right now for affluent kids to find summer jobs, right? Should schools be doing more to help their kids find summer jobs? We could require it, right? Everybody worries about career readiness. We could say, look, to get a high school diploma, you have to have worked so many hours for pay at some low wage job, because that's the best way to build these skills. I mean, I don't know. Thinking outside the box here, people. It's summertime, as you can tell from my attire. Why not think big?
And no one could accuse you of doing otherwise, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you, David. We will leave it there. Great stuff, Adam. Not afraid to take on a Nobel laureate, which I do appreciate.
Please send us your comments. So we know we've got some smart listeners. If you, tell us what you think about this.
Yes, that is true. We'd love to hear from all of you. What do you think? And not just you, Dan Goldhaber, though we are interested in your take. But Dan's always good at chiming in on Twitter and Blue Sky about his thoughts. We'd like to hear from more of you. All right. Hey, that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.